think we'll go ahead and get started here. So before I forget, I just want to make sure I get a few announcements in. So just as a reminder, Lab 11 is going to be due today. And so that's going to be all of Lab 11. That's going to be all Chapter 18. I had a few questions on what to do for the observations for the cranial nerves. So for the cranial nerves that you are able to test, just write the observation of what your partner or whoever did the test for you, what happened. So for example, if they were able to move their eyes to the left, write that they moved their eyes to the left, and then write the cranial nerve for each one. Okay. So for every single cranial nerve, write the observations that you're able to see on your partner or whoever helps you with the observations there. Okay. So that's going to be for the lab. Again, make sure that you do that and get that completed by tonight. Lab practical number 3 will be on Monday, so that's going to be the last lab practical of the semester. So make sure that we're studying with that and that we finish strong. Exam 4 will be a week from Monday, so that will cover chapters 16, 17, 18, 19, and then 21. So we're skipping chapter 20. Okay, so 16 through 19, and then chapter 21 as well. And then the career essay will be due on May 11th. So make sure you're thinking about that and try to do some of that research on what you plan to be doing. Cool. Any questions on anything that's coming up?
No.
Okay. All righty. So with that, we'll go ahead and dive into chapter 18 again. So we're going to finish off talking about the brain. Okay. So is everyone able to see the PowerPoint right now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So today we're going to be looking at the brain. So on Monday we looked at some specific structures that help to protect the brain in terms of the meninges, the skull. We looked at the cerebrospinal fluid, and we looked at the blood-brain barrier. And then we started looking at a few different pieces of the brain and see what some of their functions were. And so Tamim actually was talking to me earlier, and he actually reminded me about something that used to happen back in the day as a way for scientists to try to determine what different parts of the brain would do. And so in order to try to figure out what different parts of the brain were responsible for, what scientists used to do way back when was they would actually perform lobotomies and open up people's skulls and start taking out parts of the brain or cutting out parts of the brain or start stimulating parts of the brain directly and then see how their responses would change. Okay? So for example, they might take out a certain part of the brain and see how that resulted in changing their behavior or see how it affected their ability to process vision. Okay? And so that was one of the really kind of, I guess, primitive ways of learning about the brain and learning about what all the different parts of the brain do. So luckily we've come, a far cry from that. And so we're actually able to learn about the brain in a much less invasive way. And so we're going to look at a few of the techniques at the end of today's lecture. But then we're also going to be looking at what all the different parts of the brain are going to be involved in. So we're going to have a little bit of fun with this. This one is a pretty interesting chapter, I think. So we'll have some fun here. Okay, so that's the game plan. So we're looking at the brain, kind of part 2 here. So the first part of the brain that we're going to be looking at is the cerebellum.
Oh, yeah.
So the cerebellum is going to be this portion of the brain right here, okay? And it kind of translates to a little brain. Okay? And so it actually kind of looks like a little version of our brain here. Okay? And so it sits on the posterior side of the medulla and the pons, which we talked about on Monday. And it's going to sit inferior to the cerebrum. Okay? So the cerebrum is major mass of brain tissue here. So what separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum is this groove or this fissure here called the transverse fissure. Okay? And so you kind of, is an easy way to remember it. Transverse meaning that it's going to cut from the top, separate the top from the bottom, okay, the superior from the inferior. And that's pretty much what the transverse fissure will do. It's going to separate the top half of the brain or the cerebrum from the cerebellum inferior to that. Okay? And so one of the things that we'll notice about the cerebellum is that it has a lot of folds within it. And so it actually has a ton of folds, and it actually seems to have a lot more folds than the cerebellum, or so the cerebrum itself does. Okay. Now, because the cerebellum has so many folds, that helps to increase the surface area of the cerebellum itself, which means that we're able to pack a lot more neurons in there. Okay. And so this is actually really interesting because if you think about all the neurons that are inside the brain, okay, half of them are just here, right here inside the cerebellum. Okay? Half of your brain's neurons are right here inside the cerebellum, while the other half are scattered throughout the brain here, which is pretty incredible, pretty cool to see, just how the concentration of the neurons are, okay, in different parts of the brain. So the role of the cerebellum is to kind of help coordinate your motor movements, regulate your posture, and then regulate your balance as well. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at motor movements. Okay, so one of the major things that the cerebellum is going to be involved in is regulating and coordinating your body's voluntary muscle contractions. Okay? And so when you think about writing on a piece of paper, or you think about raising your hand or walking from point A to point B, okay, your cerebellum is going to be involved in making sure that all of your motor movements are done efficiently and done in a way that kind of maximizes your ability to do whatever it is you need to do. Okay? So it's going to make sure everything is coordinated and prevent you from doing kind of unnecessary actions. Okay? The other thing that it's going to do is it's going to help to smooth out your actions. Okay? So for example, if you have a lot of kind of herky-jerky movements, the cerebellum is going to be involved with inhibiting some of those extraneous movements that you don't need to do, okay? Inhibiting those so that you get nice, smooth, easy movements to help you kind of make different types of muscle contractions. And then the last thing that it's able to do is it's going to help you to kind of correct your motor movements as well. Okay, so for example, if you were to imagine kind of catching a ball, so let's say you're playing baseball, you got a fly ball coming towards you. Okay, if you try to take your hand and try to catch the ball, okay, but you start to notice, oh, I extended my hand too far out. I need to bring it in a little bit further in order to catch the ball. The cerebellum is going to be involved with bringing your hand back in order to help you accomplish your motor goal, in this case, to catch the ball. Okay. So it's going to help to kind of coordinate all of your motor movements and make sure that they're all done efficiently and help you reach your muscle contractions goal, I should say. Okay. And then the other thing, like I said, it's going to help to regulate your body's posture and your balance and equilibrium. So when we take a look at the cerebellum, if we take a look from the superior view down, one of the things that we'll see right down the middle is going to be a constricted area right down the center called the vermis. Okay. So the vermis here is going to separate the cerebellum into two lobes, or into two hemispheres, I should say. Okay. There's going to be a left cerebellar hemisphere and then a right cerebellar hemisphere. Okay. So these hemispheres are going to be divided up into individual lobes. Okay. This is going to be an anterior lobe up here, and then a posterior lobe on the posterior side, and they're going to be separated by some fissures. But these anterior and posterior lobes are going to be involved with helping to maintain your subconscious skeletal muscle movements and help to make sure that those movements are done effectively and efficiently as well. Okay. So for that reason, the cerebellum is going to be involved with both conscious and subconscious motor movements, or motor contractions. Okay, so that's that. Then if we look at the cerebellum from an inferior view, another lobe that we're going to be able to see is called the flocculonodular lobe. Okay? So the flocculonodular lobe is going to be right here. And so this lobe is going to be specifically involved with maintaining your balance and equilibrium. Okay? So without that lobe present, okay, you wouldn't be able to balance, and you wouldn't be able to kind of maintain your balance as you kind of go throughout your day. So that's that. And then we're also going to see some cerebellar peduncles. These cerebellar peduncles are going to help to attach these brainstem to the cerebellum. And that's going to be important because there's going to be a lot of sensory and motor tracts that are going to be running through the cerebellar peduncles that are going to help connect the cerebellum to other parts of the brain. Okay? And so that's going to allow the brain to be able to or other parts of the brain to be able to communicate with the cerebellum. And then in some cases allow the rest of the brainstem to be able to communicate with the cerebellum as well. Cool. Any questions on the cerebellum so far?
Yeah. So the flocculonodular lobe, is it somehow connected to the vermis, or what am I seeing here?
So it is kind of connected to the vermis. So the vermis is going to run from the top side of from the superior side of the cerebellum all the way to the inferior side, kind of like a moon. And then the flocculonodular lobe is going to kind of run across the middle, and the middle portion is going to make contact with the vermis itself.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions here? All right, so now when we take a look at the cerebellum's anatomy, one of the things that we're going to see is going to be a cerebellar cortex. Okay? So when you think cortex, think the superficial or the outermost layer of that structure. Okay? So the cerebellar cortex would be the outermost layer of the cerebellum. Okay? That's going to be this region over here, this outermost region of gray matter surrounding the outside of the cerebellum. Okay? Now within that, we're going to find a structure called the folia. And so the folia are these ridges of gray matter that will start to dive inward and dive interiorly into the cerebellum here. Okay, so they're just ridges of gray matter. And then we're going to reach some regions of white matter. Okay? And so that region of white matter is called the arbor vitae. Okay? And so the arbor vitae are almost look like the leaves of a tree, or kind of almost look like a tree here. And so these are these tracts of white matter that are going to be deep to the folia, and you can see that a little bit over here too as well. Okay, so this is what you would see in a cadaver. All this white matter that kind of spreads out kind of like a tree. Those are the arbor vitae. There's going to be lots of white matter in there to help kind of help with the motor movements. And then the last thing that we'll see are the cerebellar nuclei. And so the cerebellar nuclei are going to be other regions of gray matter that are going to be even deeper to the arbor vitae. And so those will have lots of axons that are going to send impulses from the cerebellum to other places within the brain and the spinal cord as well. Okay, so it's going to be kind of a connection area that is going to allow the cerebellum to connect and communicate with other parts of the nervous system. Okay, so again, on the outer region, we're going to have the cerebellar cortex. The inner region, we're going to have some of the folia, and then the white matter in the middle is going to be the arbor vitae. Okay, so if the cerebellum gets damaged, okay, that can lead to a condition called ataxia, and there's different types of ataxias. Okay, so ataxia is just an inability to coordinate your muscle movements. So your muscle movements start to kind of move without coordination with any of the other muscles. Okay? And so this becomes a little bit more difficult to have efficient motor movements. Okay? And so this can happen in the skeletal muscles where you can have ataxia. The skeletal muscle, your skeletal muscles just don't contract in a coordinated manner. It can happen with your speech muscles as well, and so that can cause some of your speech to be impaired. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna watch a quick video of what ataxia would look like in a few patients. So is everyone able to see the YouTube video?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can make this full screen and see if this cooperates with me today. A second. Okay, is it full screen for you guys?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So we're gonna watch a couple of videos of ataxia happening in some patients. And we're gonna kind of see some of the incoordination that happens here. So here we've got a patient that is trying to walk normally, but you can see it's a little bit difficult for him. And in order for him to turn around, he has to kind of pitter-patter his feet. Okay. So here he's trying to put his feet in front of, one foot in front of the other. And then again, it looks a little bit difficult. This patient is trying to touch his nose to his finger, to the patient's finger. And you can see it's a little bit difficult for him to be able to aim and get it right. So he has a hard time actually pinpointing the top of her finger. Here you can see some muscle contractions that shouldn't be happening at all, just because she's standing still. And so we see just regular muscle contractions taking place there that shouldn't be happening. So we see some uncoordination there. So this one, we're looking at a patient's eyes. He's supposed to be moving it from side to side, but again, you can kind of see his eyes start to move back and forth a little bit, instead of moving smoothly from left to right. And we'll see this a little bit more clear on another patient in a second. So here we're looking at the same patient. You see he doesn't really have any reflexes. Okay. And so again, very little coordination taking place. This is another patient, and you can see she's got ataxia as well. She's supposed to be standing still, but again, you can see her hands kind of twitching back and forth. Here's another patient who's supposed to be looking from side to side. And again, pay attention to his eyes. You can see they're kind of jerking back and forth. So the muscles that control his eyes are not working effectively. You can kind of see it droops up a little, or flips up a bit. And again, you start to see that herky-jerky movement of his eye muscles. And then again, with this patient, she's supposed to be moving her head from side to side, but her head goes first and then her eyes follow second, which they should be happening at the same pace. But you can see she moves her head first and then the eyes follow. So these are all different types of ataxia that can take place. And again, that's going to be due to the cerebellum not working effectively, or not working like it should. So let me kind of switch back here. Are there any questions on ataxia? Actually, one other thing I forgot to mention here. So alcohol actually causes a version of ataxia as well. So remember when we were looking at the blood-brain barrier on Monday, we were saying that certain things are able to pass through the blood-brain barrier. Some things that are good, some things that are bad. Okay. Alcohol is one of those things that is able to cross the blood-brain barrier, and specifically, it's going to be affecting the cerebellum. Okay. Which is why if you get a little, a little happy juice inside you on St. Patty's Day, it starts to cause you to start, stumbling over yourself. Your speech is kind of slurred a little bit. You might trip. Your movements aren't as coordinated, and you get the symptoms of kind of being drunk. Okay? And that is due to the alcohol actually inhibiting the cerebellum's activity. Okay? So kind of a little interesting tidbit there. So that's the cerebellum. Any questions on the cerebellum or ataxia or anything like this?
Is there like is it a disease, George, or is it just damage? Is it just only damage?
It's more of just damage. It's not necessarily a disease. It's not like it can't be transmitted from one person to the next, but it usually is something that either happens because of some kind of trauma to the brain, or different types of substances that you might be taking in. So for example, like drugs and alcohol can lead to ataxia for long periods of time if kind of left unchecked. It's usually kind of just more of a damage thing that happens to various people. But again, it's not something that's common, so it shouldn't be happening, but sometimes it does.
Well, thank you.
So the patients go through therapy to, or
Yeah. So Sharon's question was, do the patients go through therapy? In some cases, yes. So the patients would need to go through some therapy to kind of help try to coach their muscles into doing what they're supposed to be doing. In some cases, therapy does have a kind of limited success rate, just because it's so hard to repair the cerebellum itself. So again, the brain doesn't really repair itself that well. And so if there's damage to the cerebellum, there's a few things you can do to help fix it, but or to help kind of treat it, I guess. But because the damage to the brain itself, it makes it very difficult to actually see large degrees of success with any kind of therapy.
okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So in short, we do experience some
questions?
level of ataxia over the weekends, right?
Yes, so we do. So we do experience some levels of ataxia over the weekend. Yeah. So occasionally we do experience some levels of ataxia. Yeah.
Doesn't have to be over the weekend only.
Well,
Exactly. It doesn't
it's
have to be over the
almost
weekend.
a daily thing.
One
Yeah,
time I had-
exactly. Especially now that we're all staying at home every day this week.
Yeah, I know.
every week. It can happen anytime now.
One time I had an inner ear infection, and it affected my
Mhm.
equilibrium. Like I felt like I was gonna take a step with my foot, but I felt like I should have already hit the step, but I was still, my foot wasn't on the end of the step. Does that have anything to do
Yes.
with the cerebellum?
So that has to do, my guess is that probably has to do with the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve 8, which we looked at on Monday.
Yeah.
And so the vestibulocochlear nerve has like two branches to it. One of them is the vestibular branch, which is responsible for your equilibrium. So if that particular nerve stops working effectively, that nerve, I believe, sends information to the cerebellum, and I'm pretty sure it does. Okay. And so if that nerve isn't working effectively, that's going to inhibit the cerebellum from being able to do its job and being able to gauge how well your muscle contractions are happening. And it's also going to impair it from being able to correct it. So it's kind of a two-fold process, but I think the main culprit there is the vestibulocochlear nerve and not necessarily the cerebellum itself.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I think they said it was vertigo. Vertigo? Yeah.
Yeah. My brother had that too. So yeah, it's the vestibulocochlear nerve. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem. Cool. Any other questions here? Okay, so that is the cerebellum. Okay, so that's the first region. The next region we're going to look at is the diencephalon. Okay, so the diencephalon is going to be this region here, right in the core of the brain. And so it's going to be superior to the midbrain, which is right over here. And then it's going to also be surrounded by the cerebral hemispheres that are going to be on either side of it. So the diencephalon is going to basically stretch from the cerebrum all the way down to the brainstem. And then it's also going to contain the third ventricle, which again is where we're going to see some of our cerebrospinal fluid. So the diencephalon is going to contain three major regions. It's going to have the thalamus, then we're going to have the hypothalamus, which we see down here. And then we're also going to find the epithalamus, which is going to be back here. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start with the thalamus. So the thalamus is going to be, like I said, inside the core of the brain, and it's actually going to make up about 80% of the diencephalon. Okay. And so the thalamus is going to be made up of two kind of paired masses of gray matter right in the center of the brain. And its major role is to act as a relay station for lots of sensory input. Okay. So I mean, kind of think of the thalamus as acting like a receptionist. So for example, if you go to a hotel or you go to a hospital or something and you go to the receptionist is going to greet you and then tell you where you're supposed to go. Okay. That's basically what the thalamus is going to be doing. Okay. So any kind of sensory input, any kind of sensory input, whether it comes from visual stimulus, tactile stimuli, auditory stimuli, taste stimuli, all of the stimuli that you can get, all the sensory stimuli except for smell, are going to end up running through the thalamus. Okay. Once those sensory impulses reach the thalamus is then going to direct all those sensory impulses to different areas of the body or different areas of the brain to get processed. Okay. So for example, if you're getting a visual input or visual stimulus, the thalamus is going to say, okay, your visual input, you're going to go to this part of the brain. Okay, your auditory input, you're going to go to that part of the brain. Okay, your tactile input, you're going to go to this part of the brain. So it's going to be able to direct all types of sensory information to specific areas of the brain in order to get processed. Okay. So that's going to be the major function there. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Cool. Good. So that's the major role. Okay, helping to be a relay station for all kinds of sensory information except for the smell. Okay, except for olfactory senses. Now, the flip side of this is it's also going to help with motor impulses. Okay? So all kinds of motor information that's going to come from the cerebellum and the basal nuclei are going to end up running to the thalamus. And then from there, the thalamus is then going to direct that motor information to the primary motor area of the brain. Okay? And then from there, that primary motor area can then initiate motor contractions. Okay? So it's going to be a relay station for sensory input as well as for motor input to a lesser degree. The third thing it's going to do is it's going to help to connect all the other parts of the brain to one another. Okay? So it's going to act as a relay station for allowing one part of the cerebrum to be able to communicate with another part of the cerebrum and allow some communication between different parts of the brain. And then the last thing it's going to be able to do is it's going to help with regulating different autonomic responses and helping to maintain your consciousness. So the thalamus is one of the most important parts of the brain because, again, that's going to be helping you to be able to receive a lot of the sensory stimuli and motor stimuli as well. Okay, so this is what the thalamus kind of looks like here. So you would see kind of one mass on one side, one mass on the other. And again, each thalamus is going to have a specific specific nuclei within or specific regions within it that are going to be responsible for performing different tasks. So that's the thalamus. You don't need to worry about what they are, just know that they're there. Okay, that's the thalamus. Now, superior and kind of posterior to the thalamus is going to be another region called the epithalamus. And this is a pretty small structure here. And so the epithalamus is going to be a region that's going to contain a specific gland called the pineal gland. So the pineal gland, which we'll talk about more when we get to chapter 22, is a gland that's going to be producing a hormone called melatonin. And melatonin not to be confused with melanin. So melatonin is a hormone that's going to help to regulate your circadian rhythms. And so it's going to help you to kind of fall asleep. So a lot of times when people have difficulty sleeping, they might go to the store and pick up, melatonin, in a bottle, which again helps you to sleep. That melatonin is the same melatonin that gets produced from the pineal gland inside the epithalamus. And so we produce melatonin in response to different types of light stimuli. So when we have lots of light coming into our eyes, we're not going to be producing as much melatonin, and that's going to help us stay awake. When it becomes more dark, our melatonin production is going to increase, and that's going to help us fall asleep. So this is a hormone that's going to help to regulate your circadian rhythms and kind of your sleep-wake cycle.
George,
So that's yeah.
I have a quick question, but I don't mean to cut you off.
Yeah. No, you're good.
Okay. So let's say like you stay up super late. What happens to melatonin then is your pineal gland? I don't know how to pronounce it. But does that release a lot of melatonin then because you're super sleepy?
Yes. So it's the pineal gland as well as a few other structures as well. So it's the pineal gland as well as the hypothalamus, which we'll talk about in a second. And so basically what happens is your body should be getting like a certain amount of sleep, or it should be used to getting a certain amount of sleep. But let's say you stay awake all night, right? Then your brain is going to be kind of tired from working all day without getting a chance to kind of rest while you're sleeping. And so that is what's kind of it throws off your sleep-wake cycle, and it basically tells your brain, hey, it should be nighttime, we should be sleeping. We haven't slept in a long time, we've been awake for this amount of hours, so we should be sleeping any second now. And that's why you start getting kind of more tired. You start releasing a little bit more melatonin, and that creates that tired feeling that you get. Does that make more sense?
Got it. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so that's the pineal gland, which is again inside the epithalamus. And then also inside the epithalamus, we're going to find some organs called the circumventricular organs. And those are going to be within the third ventricle. And what they do is they just monitor different changes within the blood, specifically chemical changes. And so by monitoring all those chemical changes, they're going to help to regulate your endocrine activities in terms of what hormones you're going to be releasing at different points in time. It's going to have to regulate kind of the homeostasis of your nervous system. It's going to have to regulate your blood pressure, your fluid balance, and your salt and water concentrations, as well as your hunger and thirst levels. So this was going to be involved with doing a bunch of different things in terms of regulating your body's homeostasis. Okay. All right, then the last part of the diencephalon is the hypothalamus. And so the hypothalamus is going to be located kind of anterior and inferior to the thalamus here. And so that's what we're going to see, this structure here. And so the hypothalamus is responsible for regulating the majority of your homeostatic processes, and then maintaining a lot of your bodily activities. So among a bunch of things, it's going to be helping to regulate kind of your somatic, visceral, and then special senses. Pretty much every sense is going to be kind of regulated by the hypothalamus. It's going to help to regulate your osmotic pressure, which is again your salt water concentrations, your glucose levels, your hormone levels, and then the temperature of the blood. Okay, but one of the most important things it's going to be doing is regulating your hormone levels. Okay. So, and again, we'll talk about that when we get to the endocrine system in chapter 22. All right, so this one, like I said, its main role is going to be in terms of regulating and maintaining homeostasis. Okay. So it's got 6 major functions, and again, there's multiple different kind of subparts to each of these functions, and again, we'll talk about a few of these in chapter 22. But one of the most important roles, is to help to maintain control of the autonomic nervous system. Okay? So the autonomic nervous system, like I said, is going to be helping to control different visceral organs. Okay? It's going to help to control your heart rate, going to control your respiratory rate, your breathing rate, going to determine the contractions that are happening inside your bladder, the uterus, for example, the GI tract, your blood pressure. Okay, all kinds of different types of visceral activities are all going to be controlled by the autonomic nervous system, and the hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system. So as a result, it's going to be controlling all the other things as well. Okay. So controlling the autonomic nervous system is going to be one of the major functions of the hypothalamus. Number two is it's also going to be producing a few hormones. Okay? And so as it produces a few hormones, the hormones that it does produce is going to help to regulate the production of other hormones that are going to help to regulate your body's physiology, okay, over the period of a few hours or even days at a time. The third function is to regulate your emotion and your behavioral patterns. Okay? So when you feel happy, when you feel sad, when you feel angry, when you're performing different types of behaviors, okay, a lot of that is going to be regulated by the hypothalamus as well. Okay? It's going to help to regulate your thirst and your hunger based off of your salt and water concentrations inside your body, as well as kind of what's going on in your GI tract. It's going to regulate your body's temperature, and then it's also going to help with regulating your sleep-wake cycle as well, okay, in terms of regulating your circadian rhythms and then your consciousness states as well. Okay. So the hypothalamus is doing all kinds of different things in terms of regulating everything that's going on inside the body. Okay. So it's an incredibly, incredibly crucial structure. All right. So within the hypothalamus, there's a few different nuclei, and similar to the thalamus, each of these nuclei is going to have a specific role in terms of regulating your body's homeostasis. And you don't need to worry about what any of these nuclei are called. Again, just know that they're there. They all have their own specific roles. Okay. Any questions on the diencephalon, whether it's the thalamus, the hypothalamus, or the epithalamus?
No, I think it's clear.
Okay. All right, so that's the diencephalon. All right, so now the next structure we're going to take a look at here is the cerebrum. Okay. So the cerebrum, like I mentioned before, is kind of the main mass of your brain tissue. Okay. So the cerebrum is going to be really important because this is going to be involved with integrating and processing lots of sensory input and lots of sensory information, as well as just neural information where you're just communicating from one side of the brain to the other or communicating between neurons. Okay. So the cerebrum is where all that integration process is going to be taking place. So in addition to integrating lots of sensory input, it's also going to help with initiating and like lots of motor, voluntary muscle contractions throughout the body as well. Okay. So controlling and initiating voluntary motor contractions are the other part of the cerebrum's functions. Okay. So when we see the cerebrum is going to be divided up into two halves. Okay. The first half is called the thing that separates them is the longitudinal fissure. And so the longitudinal fissure is a very deep groove here, and that's going to separate the cerebrum into two cerebral hemispheres, a left cerebral hemisphere and then a right cerebral hemisphere. So that is going to be done by the longitudinal fissure. Now the longitudinal fissure, like I said, is going to separate the two halves from one another, but it's only going to go so far. At the bottom of the longitudinal fissure, at the kind of the base of it, we're going to find a structure called the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is a kind of a pretty thick band of white matter that's going to be able to connect the left side of the brain to the right side of the brain. Okay, connect the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. And again, that's going to be at the floor of the longitudinal fissure. Okay. So the longitudinal fissure will separate the two halves, okay, but they're going to be connected to one another by the corpus callosum. And that's going to allow the left hemisphere to be able to communicate with the right hemisphere. Okay. And so that's what we see right here. This very large, very thick piece of white matter that's going to connect the two bands of the two sides of the brain. Okay. Okay. That's the corpus callosum. That's a pretty important. Okay. Because again, without the corpus callosum, the left side of your brain and your right side of your brain would not be able to communicate with each other. All right. Yeah. Was there a question? Okay. All right. So if we were to take a frontal cut through the cerebrum, okay, we would see kind of a bunch of regions of gray matter and then white matter and then some gray matter in the middle. Okay? So the outer rim is going to be made up of gray matter, and so that is going to be what we call the cerebral cortex. Okay? So again, when we're thinking about a cortex, the cortex is going to be the outermost or the most superficial part of that structure. Okay? So the cerebral cortex is going to be this outermost rim of gray matter that's going to be on the outside of the brain. Okay? And then just deep to that, we're going to find some white matter. You can just regions of white matter throughout the brain. And then if we go a little bit deeper to that, we're going to find some other regions of gray matter that are going to be more kind of deeper within the brain. So these are going to be some gray matter nuclei that we're going to look at in a little bit later. Okay. So cerebral cortex, gray matter, white matter, and then some gray matter nuclei down in the center of the brain. All right, so now when we look at the cerebrum, one of the things that we're going to be kind of easily noticing is that there's going to be lots of folds and lots of grooves within the brain, okay, within the cerebrum. Okay, so what we talk about first are the gyrus, is a gyrus. Okay, so a gyrus is just a fold of the brain or of the cerebral cortex. So right here where we see this kind of lump here, that is called a gyrus. Okay, multiple would be a gyri. Okay. Then we have some very deep grooves in between those folds. Okay. So those deep grooves are what we call fissures. And then if we have a shallow groove, which we see over here, okay, the shallow grooves are called a sulcus, okay, or a sulci for plural. So a gyrus is a fold, a fissure would be a very deep groove in between folds, and then a sulcus would be a shallow groove in between folds. All right, and so now that we've looked at all the different folds and different grooves, we're going to see that the brain is going to have specific lobes, okay? And each lobe is going to have a specific function. So the first lobe is called the frontal lobe, and so the frontal lobe is going to be responsible for your personality, your thinking, decision-making, your logic, your intellect, your intelligence, imagination, creativity. Okay, so all of that is going to be inside the frontal lobe. So pretty much anything that has to do with your executive functioning or higher thinking, and that is going to be taking place inside the frontal lobe. Okay. So one way that you can kind of remember that is kind of if you're thinking real hard, one of the things that you'll be doing is you're going to be kind of pressing on the front of your forehead. Okay. So that's going to be where your frontal lobe is. That's going to be where you're going to be doing the majority of your thinking, right in here in the frontal lobe. The next one is the parietal lobe. And so the parietal lobe is going to be involved with your tactile sensations, so processing and interpreting tactile sensations. Okay, so anything that you're able to feel on your skin, or whether it's pressure, whether it's pain, whether it's vibrations, whether it's temperature, anything that you're able to physically feel, okay, that is going to be directed to the parietal lobe. Okay, so the parietal lobe is going to be involved and responsible for interpreting all of that information. The third lobe is the temporal lobe. Okay? And so the temporal lobe is going to be involved with hearing. It's going to be involved with your auditory perception, okay? Being able to hear different things inside your environment and interpret what exactly you're hearing. And then the last lobe is the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe is going to be in the back of the brain, in the posterior side, and that is going to be involved with processing vision. Okay? And so what's kind of helpful about learning about the names of all these lobes is that they're actually named with the same names as the skull bones that cover them. Okay? So the frontal bone will cover the frontal lobe, the parietal bone will cover the parietal lobe, the occipital bone will cover the occipital lobe, and the temporal bone will cover the temporal lobe. Okay? So pretty easy to remember here. So again, frontal lobe involved with kind of higher thinking, logic, personality, decision-making, things like that. Parietal lobe is going to be involved with your tactile sensations. The temporal lobe is going to be involved with hearing. And so one way you can remember that is your temporal lobe is going to be right next to your ears. And so your ears are used for hearing. All the information is going to be directed to your temporal lobes here. Okay. And then the occipital lobe over here in the back is going to be responsible for vision. Okay. So again, each lobe has a specific function. Any questions on these lobes so far, or any part of the cerebrum so far?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that the frontal lobe has a role in helping with our imagination and whatnot, and our personality and our thinking.
Mhm.
Doesn't the hippocampus also help with our imagination as well?
The hippocampus, to a lesser degree, does. Yeah.
Okay.
So the hippocampus is more so for learning and memory, but it does have a little bit of a role in terms of your imagination too.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Is that you, Johnny?
It is.
Oh, good to see you from you. Good to hear from you.
That was your last task too.
Cool. Oh, nice. All right, cool. Okay, so that's the. Any other questions on the lobes of the brain here before we go forward?
No.
Okay, we'll revisit this as well at the end of this too. Okay, so when we're looking at the different parts of the cerebrum, the different lobes are going to be separated by different sulci. Okay? And so the first sulcus is going to be the central sulcus. And so the central sulcus helps to separate the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Okay? And you just kind of separate those two and allow them to be their own individual entities. Okay? Then we see the parieto-occipital lobe. And so the parieto-occipital lobe is going to help to separate, or sorry, the parieto-occipital sulcus separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Okay. And then we also find the lateral cerebral sulcus, also called the lateral fissure, and that helps to separate the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. Okay. So those are the three sulci that help to separate the different lobes of the brain. Okay, so this is just a larger picture, again, to kind of show you all the different parts of the brain. And here you see the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. Here we see the cerebellum down below, where it's got lots of folds again. I think that's all we've talked about so far, so that's good. Okay. All right, so question here. So the structure indicated on the figure belongs to which part of the brain? So here we're looking at this part here. Is this the part of the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, or the ventricle?
Diencephalon? See?
I'm hearing diencephalon. Do you agree with diencephalon?
I would
Yes,
say B.
it's correct. Should be
Yeah,
correct.
B.
Yes.
Diencephalon.
Perfect. Yes, that would be the diencephalon. Perfect. So kind of a follow-up question. So what are the three parts to the diencephalon?
Epithalamus, hypothalamus, and
Thalamus,
thalamus, right?
thalamus, epithalamus,
Right.
and hypothalamus.
Yeah, what they said.
Exactly. So we're going to have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and then the epithalamus. Perfect. Really good. Good. Okay, next question. So which of the following is false? Okay, so A, the transverse fissure separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. B, the cerebellar peduncles attach the cerebellum to the brainstem. C, the thalamus makes up 80% of the diencephalon. D, the hypothalamus is a small part of the epithalamus. Or E, none of these are correct.
Is it C?
I think it's
I'm
D,
hearing
the
C.
hypothalamus, the small part of the epithalamus.
Well,
Okay.
epithalamus is small. I think the epithalamus doesn't really look like it looks like its own structure in a way, right?
Right, it is. And so that would give us D. Right, so the epithalamus and the hypothalamus are not the same. Okay, they're two separate structures.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Good. But everything else is true. So the transverse fissure does separate the cerebellum from the cerebrum. The cerebellar peduncles attach the cerebellum to the brainstem. The thalamus makes up the majority of the diencephalon. Okay. So all three of those were true. The last one that wasn't true was the hypothalamus being part of the epithalamus. Okay. That one's not true. All right, good. All right, next question. So important functions of the hypothalamus include which of the following? We got A, production of hormones. B, regulation of emotional and behavioral patterns. C, control of the autonomic nervous system. D, regulation of eating and drinking. Or E, all of the above.
All of the above choices.
I'm hearing E. Agree with E?
Yeah.
Oh, wait. But
No, I'm looking at epithalamus.
does it produce
Hypothalamus.
or just tell them when to go out for A?
So it does produce hormones. Yeah, so the
Yeah,
hypothalamus
it
does
does.
produce its own hormones, but it also helps to tell the other glands what
Yeah,
to produce
it's
as
E.
well.
It's E.
Yeah. So E is correct. Yeah. So yeah, everything else is true. So it does produce its own hormones. It does regulate your emotion and behavior, regulates your autonomic nervous system, and then regulates your eating and drinking too.
Mhm.
Those are all parts of the the functions of the hypothalamus.
It also controls the basal metabolic rate, right? Is that
It
is that one of the
does to a
functions of-
degree. To a degree, it does. There is a gland called the thyroid gland that's
The thyroid.
involved with maintaining your metabolic rate.
Uh-huh.
But the thyroid gland is dependent on the anterior pituitary gland, and the
Right.
anterior pituitary gland is dependent on the hypothalamus. So it kind of has an indirect role in helping to regulate your basal metabolic rate, but not a direct role, I should say.
I see.
Yeah, but it does play a role.
Okay, thanks.
And again, we'll look at that when we get to chapter 22. So don't worry too much about that right now.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Any questions on anything so far?
Yes, I have one question.
Yeah, go ahead, Elijah.
How many parts are there to the diencephalon? Are there 2 or 3? I keep looking back at the slide.
There's 3.
There's 3? Okay.
Yeah, there's 3. Depending on, it kind of depends. Depending on who you ask, some people will just say 2, so just the thalamus and the hypothalamus. But for the sake of our class, we're going to focus on the 3. So we're going to also include the epithalamus.
Epithalamus. Okay, so the thalamus, epithalamus, and then the hypothalamus. Okay.
Correct.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So now, any other questions here?
Yeah, sorry, Dad. I wanted to clarify that last question he said. So that's 3 parts? There are 3 or?
Yes. So for the hypothalamus, for the sake of our class, we're going to say there's 3 parts.
Okay.
There's the thalamus, the
That's
hypothalamus, and then the epithalamus.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, that's where I got a little confused. I was like,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
It's the diencephalon.
Yeah. I think in that first picture, it only shows the 2.
Yeah, it does.
And I drew it as.
Yeah. In this first picture, it just shows the thalamus and the hypothalamus. But for our class, we're also going to include the epithalamus in there too.
And also, the name says it's diencephalon. It doesn't say triencephalon, so I think that's
Yeah, and that's where it kind of throws everything off a little bit. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the sucky part about it.
That's funny.
Okay, cool. Any other questions?
Thank you, George.
No problem. No problem. Okay. All right. So that's going to lead us into our next structure, which is called the basal nuclei. And so the basal nuclei are these 3 masses of gray matter that are going to sit on either side of the thalamus. Okay? And they're going to sit within the cerebral hemisphere, each cerebral hemisphere. Okay? So there's really going to be a total of 6, 3 on each side. Okay? And so the first 2 of the basal nuclei are going to be lateral to the thalamus. Okay? So here we have the thalamus. Okay? We have one thalamus over here, the other thalamus over here. Okay? And so the first 2 of the basal nuclei are going to be located laterally to the thalamus. Okay? And so we call the 2 of them together the lentiform nucleus. Okay? So the lentiform nucleus is made up of 2 basal nuclei, one called the globus pallidus, which is the one that's closest to the thalamus, and then the other one is called the putamen. So the globus pallidus is going to be close to the thalamus here, and so it's going to be responsible for regulating your muscle tone. Okay? And that muscle tone is going to be used for helping you to maintain your posture or helping you to perform different types of motor movements. But in either case, it's going to be regulating your muscle tone for different types of contractions. Okay? So that is going to be the globus pallidus here. Okay? The second of the basal nuclei is called the putamen. And so the putamen is kind of further away from the thalamus, closer to the cerebral cortex. And so it's going to be responsible for anticipating what body movements you're going to be performing. Okay. And so those are the first 2. Those make up the lentiform nucleus. Okay. The third of the basal nucleus, or basal nuclei, are called the caudate nucleus. Okay. And so the caudate nucleus helps to kind of regulate your eye movements. So all 3 of these here are going to be considered the basal nuclei. Back in the day, they used to be called the basal ganglia, which is kind of an incorrect term because ganglia are usually in the peripheral nervous system, and nuclei refer to nervous tissue inside the central nervous system. So they changed the name to the basal nuclei. So if you hear basal ganglia and basal nuclei, they mean the same thing, but basal nuclei is the more accurate term. So again, they're going to be responsible for controlling different types of movements throughout the body. And so this is what another picture of it. If you were to take a lateral view, here we see the caudate nucleus. Here we see the putamen, which is again going to be on the closest to the cerebral cortex, the more superficial part. And then deeper to the putamen, or more medial to the putamen, you would see the globus pallidus, which we can't see from this view. Okay, and that's just another picture there for you to be able to see it a little bit better. Okay, so the basal nuclei are not going to work independently. Okay, they're going to be working hand in hand with the midbrain as well as the diencephalon. Okay? And so specifically the part of the midbrain they're going to be working with is the substantia nigra. And we'll talk about that in a second. Okay? But the basal nuclei, they're kind of what they'll be doing is they're going to be taking lots of input from the cerebral cortex. They have lots of information from the cerebral cortex, and they're going to be generating some motor outputs. Okay? And they're going to be kind of producing kind of the instructions on what motor movements to do, and they're going to send those instructions to the cerebral cortex, but in order to do so, it's going to be moving through the thalamus. Okay? So again, that's going to be where the thalamus is going to act as a relay station for some of the motor impulses. Okay? So input is coming in from the cerebral cortex to the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei will then determine what motor movements need to be done, and then send that information through the thalamus and then into the cerebral cortex from there. Okay. So the overall function of the basal nuclei is to help with regulating the initiation and termination of your body functions, or your body movements. Okay. Specifically, your voluntary skeletal muscle movements, as well as your subconscious skeletal muscle contractions as well. Okay. So they're going to be helping to regulate the beginning of those contractions and then stopping those contractions from happening as well. Okay. So in addition to being able to initiate and terminate motor movements, they're also going to be involved with initiating and terminating different cognitive functions as well. Okay. So in terms of beginning to pay attention in class or something, or beginning to dive into your memory to pick up some kind of information, or beginning some planning functions, or any other kind of cognitive process that needs to be done, okay, the basal nuclei are going to be responsible for beginning and ending those processes. So does that make sense so far in terms of the two functions, the two overall functions with the basal nuclei?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So in addition to being able to control body functions, or initiate and terminate body functions, and initiating and terminating mental processes, they'll also be involved, or potentially involved, with the limbic system, which helps to regulate your emotional behaviors. Okay. That one I don't think has been like fully confirmed yet, but there's a lot of evidence that explains, or that kind of suggests that the basal nuclei might be involved in that process as well. Okay. So there's a bunch of diseases that have to do with the basal nuclei kind of being impaired. You don't need to write this slide down, but I just want to go through a few of these diseases so you kind of have an idea of what its overall function is going to be doing. So the first one is Parkinson's disease. And so with people who have Parkinson's disease, they have a lot of muscle rigidity. And so the muscles are pretty stiff, and they have a few tremors in their muscles as well. And one of the reasons for that is because a lot of the neurons in the substantia nigra kind of project into the basal nuclei, specifically the putamen and the caudate nucleus, and they release dopamine. Okay? But if those neurons that run from the substantia nigra into the basal nuclei get degenerated, they are no longer able to release dopamine into the basal nuclei, and then as a result, the basal nuclei no longer have the ability to control those muscles as well. Okay, so that's Parkinson's. Huntington's is another disorder where you have lots of rapid kind of herky-jerky involuntary movements, and then it can also lead to some mental deterioration as well. This is usually due to the caudate nucleus and the putamen themselves degenerating, and when they degenerate, it causes some neurons that usually release acetylcholine and another neurotransmitter called GABA to be impaired as well, or destroyed. And so we end up getting a miscommunication between parts of the brain and then the parts of the muscle. And so you end up having lack of communication between the muscles and lots of involuntary movements. Okay. Tourette syndrome is another one. And so Tourette syndrome we've probably heard of, which usually involves with motor tics where people have lots of involuntary muscle contractions or motor movements, as well as sometimes the use of like inappropriate sounds or words, which are vocal tics. And again, those ones are due to some circuits in between the basal nuclei and the prefrontal cortex, which is involved with planning some of those different types of movements and words. Okay. If those circuits get impaired or destroyed, okay, that can cause Tourette syndrome. Schizophrenia is another one, and so that's one that usually leads to this, delusions and hallucinations and paranoia, and that is usually due to a dysfunction between the neurons between the basal nuclei and the limbic system, okay, which is involved in emotions. And then obsessive compulsive disorder is another one. So we can see there's all kinds of different diseases that can result just from impairments within the basal nuclei or neurons that lead into the basal nuclei. Okay. All right, so that's that. Any questions on the basal nuclei?
Would Alzheimer's be part of that too?
Oh, that's a good question.
Alzheimer's, not Alzheimer's is different. And so Alzheimer's, actually, I think I see where you're going. So in Alzheimer's, sometimes Alzheimer's patients have a little bit of motor, involuntary motor contractions as well. In some cases, that may be due to the basal nuclei, but it usually is just kind of more of a thing of just the cerebral cortex itself. Not so much the basal nuclei.
Okay.
So Alzheimer's would kind of be a separate side, but it can affect the basal nuclei here.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. Mm-hmm. Any other questions here? No. Okay, so now the next structure we're going to look at is the limbic system. So the limbic system is going to be a ring of structures kind of in the core of the brain around the diencephalon. It kind of surrounds the corpus callosum and the brainstem. And so the limbic system is referred to as the emotional brain. Okay, so this is the part of the brain that's responsible for regulating the majority of your emotions. Okay? And so that's going to be one thing that helps to regulate whether you're feeling happy, sad, angry, and then regulate different types of behaviors that are associated with that particular emotion. Okay. The other thing that the limbic system is able to do is it's also going to be involved with connecting olfactory sensations, so like your smell sensations, to memories. Okay? So for example, you might smell someone baking like freshly baked cookies, and that may kind of help you remember the cookies that your grandma used to make back when you were a kid. Okay, so connecting those two smells, the smell with your memory, is going to be something that happens specifically inside the limbic system. Okay. And again, that can lead to various emotions as well. So the limbic system has lots of different components. I only want you to be comfortable with a few of them. The first one is going to be inside the limbic lobe. And so the limbic lobe is going to be kind of a rim of cerebral cortex, inside the medial aspect of each cerebral hemisphere. Okay, and inside of that limbic lobe, we're going to find a structure called the hippocampus. And so the hippocampus is a region that is involved with learning and memory. And so if you remember from chapter 16 last week, when we were looking at learning and memory, or when we were looking at neurons and how they're able to regenerate, the hippocampus is one of those areas where we are actually able to produce new neurons. Okay? And it's one of the few places that it only happens in a few cases. Okay? And especially happens a lot when you're a kid, but then as you get older, this process starts to slow down. Okay? And so the hippocampus is involved with learning and memory. And then as you start to learn new things, the neurons inside the hippocampus begin to make new synapses with other neurons that are also existing within the hippocampus. And that helps to kind of connect and kind of coordinate different types of things that you've learned in the past. That's the hippocampus. The second one is the amygdala. And so the amygdala kind of looks like this little bulb here. And so this region is going to have a lot of neurons that are going to be involved with regulating your fear and aggression responses. So people who have like an overactive amygdala tend to be kind of more aggressive individuals. There's also a study where people took the amygdala out of cats, and they put the cats in situations that would normally make the cats aggressive, and because the amygdala was removed, the cats had absolutely no aggression whatsoever. And so the amygdala, as we know, is going to be a structure that is involved with fear and aggression. And the last one is the olfactory bulb. And so the olfactory bulb is one that we saw as part of cranial nerve 1, the olfactory nerve. And so that is actually part of the limbic system as well. So this is why we're able to connect smells to various memories that we've had in the past. Because it's able to connect to different areas of the limbic system, and specifically the hippocampus. All right, so that's the limbic system. So it's just a larger picture there for you to see. Okay. Any questions on the limbic system before we go forward here?
I have a question about the limbic system.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned that the limbic system is correlated or connected with like controlling emotions, whether like, you're scared, happy, sad. Does the limbic system have any connection with bipolar disorder, or is that something completely different?
Oh, not so much, I don't think. Actually, I'm not sure. I have to look into that one. I know bipolar disorder is a neurotransmitter issue mostly. But I don't know which part of the brain that usually is a problem in. It would make sense that it could be in the limbic system. I'd have to look into that one. I'm not entirely sure. That's a good question, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll look into that one. I'll let you know.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, that's really good. That's a really good question. Any other questions here? Okay. All right. So now that we've looked at all the different parts of the brain and all the different functions that they're able to do and the wide amount of functions that they're able to do, now we're going to look at the cerebral cortex itself. Okay? And so the different areas of the cerebral cortex are going to have specific jobs in terms of sensory information as well as motor information. Okay? And then in some cases also integrating information between multiple areas. Okay? So different parts of the cerebral cortex are going to be involved with different things. The first thing that we're going to be looking at here are the sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. Okay? So sensory areas are responsible for taking in sensory input from various parts of the body, okay? And then they're then going to interpret that sensory input, okay? And then allow our bodies to be able to process it. Okay? For the majority of the sensory areas, they're typically going to be on the posterior half of the cerebral hemispheres. And so we're going to take a look at a few of them. The first one is the primary somatosensory area. And so the primary somatosensory area is going to be an area that is involved with sensing your somatic senses. So basically anything that has to do with things that you can physically touch or feel. Okay? So this is going to be involved with touch, proprioception, pain, itch, thermal sensations, pressure, vibrations, okay? Anything that you can physically feel on your skin, okay? That is going to be sent to the primary somatosensory area to be processed. And so the primary somatosensory area is going to be found inside the parietal lobe, okay, right behind the central sulcus of the brain. Okay. That's going to be involved with picking up on touch senses. Okay. Okay. So that is the primary somatosensory area. Okay. Then the next one is the primary visual area. And so the primary visual area is here inside the occipital lobe and really at the tip of the occipital lobe here. And so the primary visual area is involved with receiving and processing visual information. So this is where visual information is going to get processed, okay, right here. Then the next one is the primary auditory area. And so the primary auditory area is here inside the temporal lobe, okay, right behind the lateral cerebral sulcus. And so this is going to be responsible for taking in and processing auditory information. So anything that you're able to hear is going to get delivered to the primary auditory area. All right. Okay. Then our next region is going to be the primary gustatory area. And that is going to be found right behind the post-central gyrus, right about here. That's going to be inside the parietal lobe. And so the primary gustatory area is responsible for all your taste impulses and taste perception. So if you're tasting grandma's cookies, or you're tasting some cheesecake, or you're tasting your Cinnamon Toast Crunch, whatever it may be, okay, you're going to be processing that information inside the primary gustatory area, inside the parietal lobe. All right. And the last one is the primary olfactory area. And so the primary olfactory area is going to help with your smell responses. This is going to be in the medial aspect of the temporal lobe. Okay, so we're not able to see it on this picture, but if you imagine the temporal lobe and looking on the medial side of it, that is where you would find the primary olfactory area, where you'd be able to interpret smell. All right, so that's that. Okay, so those are all these sensory areas. Okay, any questions on the sensory areas? They're relatively straightforward here. Any questions here?
I got a question. Is the gustatory, is that how you say gustatory, like, yeah, is that side by side to the olfactory?
Is it side by side with the olfactory nerve? So not
Did you
really.
okay.
The primary gustatory area is more kind of on the outside of the brain, on like the superficial parts of the brain, while the olfactory area tends to be kind of a little bit more inferior to it, and then more medial aspect of the brain too. Okay. So they're not side by side, but they're kind of in the same vicinity in a way.
Okay.
Cool. Any other questions here? Okay, so that's the sensory areas. Okay. The next ones are the motor areas, and so these ones are areas that are going to initiate different types of movements. Okay. So we only have really two main motor areas. The first one is the primary motor area, and that is going to be inside the frontal lobe, specifically in the precentral gyrus. Okay, this fold here right before, or right kind of in front of the central gyrus. And so that is going to be an area that's going to control most of our voluntary motor movements. Okay. But specifically the motor movements on the opposite side of the body. Okay. So the primary motor area on the right side of your brain is going to control the movements on the left side of your body. And again, that's going to be due to the nerves crossing inside the medulla. And then vice versa. So the left primary motor area is going to be involved with controlling the right side of your body. So they're going to be controlling voluntary movements on opposite sides of the body.
I have a question.
That's the primary motor area. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we can kind of picture the pictures from our lab homework that's due tonight. All of those like nerves that we see inside, because there's some that are sensory, some that are mixed, and some that are just motor. We could picture those are where they're innervating from. These numbers?
Yes.
Okay.
Kind of. In terms of, are you talking about this picture here on this slide and the pictures in the lab manual?
Yeah.
No, so they're numbered differently. So don't use these numbers. Yeah, no. Don't worry about these numbers.
Well, I know they're not the same numbers, but the sensory one, go to the sensory nerves, and the motor, go to the motor.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so all the sensory neurons that you're going to be seeing in the brain will typically be in the sensory areas, the very sensory areas, and then kind of leading to different other parts of the brain. The motor areas are typically going to be containing all the motor nerves, which are going to be generally on the anterior side of the brain, but again, can mix and match throughout the brain as well, too.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So that was the primary motor area. The second motor area is called the Broca's speech area. Or sometimes just called Broca's area. And so Broca's area is going to be found inside the frontal lobe as well. And so it's typically only going to be on the lateral, or the left hemisphere, the left cerebral hemisphere, and not so much the right. Although in some cases it is found on the right side. Usually it's going to be found on the left. And this is going to be involved with planning your speech, okay? Being able to plan what you want to say and how you're going to say it. And then it's also going to be involved with controlling the muscles that are involved with speech. So the muscles around your larynx, the muscles around your pharynx, and the muscles in your mouth. So Broca's speech area is going to be involved with helping to produce the speech, as well as help you plan what exactly you're going to say and how you'll say it. Okay, so those are the two motor areas. Okay. Any questions on these motor areas? Okay. All right. So the last series of areas that we're going to see are called association areas. Okay? And so association areas are going to have both motor and sensory neurons kind of involved here. And there's going to be lots of integrating of those different types of processes. Okay? So we're going to have lots of sensory integration, lots of motor integration. And we're going to basically be combining the sensory input and motor input to help us produce memory, emotions, personality, intelligence, judgment, and various other thoughts that we're able to just have inside of our brain. Okay. So these association areas are going to be really important kind of for our everyday kind of life. Okay. So the first one of these association areas is called the somatosensory association area, and that is found inside the parietal lobe. Okay. And so the somatosensory association area allows you to be able to recognize an object without looking at it. Okay. So for example, if you have your phone in your pocket, okay, let's say I have my phone in my pocket, for example, I'm not looking at it, but I put my hand in my phone or hand in my pocket, I feel something that's rectangular, I feel something that's kind of relatively hard, I feel something that's got a smooth surface, then I can know, okay, I'm feeling my phone. Okay, this must be my phone. Okay, check it out, you can kind of confirm that it is your phone. Or, you know, if you wake up in the morning and you it's dark outside, you're looking for the walls, you're gonna be able to feel that hard surface and know you're feeling the wall, okay? Or feeling some other thing in your environment. Okay? So the somatosensory association area allows you to be able to recognize an object without looking at it. Okay? And so what's really interesting about the somatosensory association area is that it also is able to store memories of things you felt in the past. Okay? So for example, if you're feeling something now, okay, you're able to compare whatever you're feeling to whatever you felt in the past. Okay? And so an example of this would be like people who are like doing like little mystery boxes where like you put your hand inside of a box and you can't see what's inside, but you're feeling something in there. You guys know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Yeah. So when you're using, or when you're kind of feeling around and you're trying to compare it to whatever you're feeling in the past and try to identify what exactly you're feeling right now, okay, that's actually using your somatosensory association area to try to identify what exactly you're feeling at that point in time. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So it's able to take memories of things you felt in the past and compare it to whatever you're feeling right now. Okay. So that's the somatosensory association area. Okay. The next one is the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is responsible for the majority of your higher thinking. So your personality, intelligence, logic, decision-making, conscious mood planning, okay, anything that has to do with higher thinking or executive functioning, that is going to be done by the prefrontal cortex. Okay. But the main things it's going to be involved with is personality, decision-making, logic, reasoning, okay, anything like that, planning, anything that's got to do with actually like thinking. Okay. And so there is a few studies about the prefrontal cortex that have been done in the past. I'll give you a few examples of all of these so you can kind of help to kind of nail these down and really help to help you learn them. But there's an example of a research study that was done about 10 years ago or so, maybe longer, some psychologists, and what they wanted to do is they wanted to look at people's prefrontal cortex. And so if you can kind of imagine the prefrontal cortex when it's working at its optimal level, when it's working at its best, kind of like a light bulb that's turned all the way on, right? So think about it that way, if it's working at its best level. And so what these psychologists did was they took their subjects and they showed them a picture of their significant other. And they looked at what the prefrontal cortex was doing. And so what they noticed is that when you were looking at a picture of your significant other, the prefrontal cortex would actually dim down. Okay. And so that was kind of a curious kind of observation. And they were like, oh, okay, what kind of things can we kind of extrapolate from this data? And one of the things that they were able to notice is that, when people are dealing or are working or in close proximity with their prefrontal cortex, or they're talking or with their prefrontal cortex, with their partner, okay, when they're with their partner, their prefrontal cortex dims down, their decision-making kind of isn't as good, their reasoning isn't as good, their judgment isn't necessarily as good. And so as a result of that, sometimes you can be a little bit more silly than you otherwise would be, okay, with your partner than you would be with someone else. which is a good thing in that particular situation because it helps you to be able to connect with your partner in that way. So that's kind of one good aspect of the prefrontal cortex kind of dimming down in terms of helping with connection with your partner. The flip side of this is that this may also be one of the reasons why it's more difficult for people to get out of abusive relationships. Because when people are with their partner, even if they're in an abusive relationship, they still think, hey, I love my partner loves me, even if they're being physically abused, emotionally abused, or mentally abused. And because of that, their prefrontal cortex, because they still love their partner, their prefrontal cortex dims down, and so their decision-making isn't as good, and so they're more resistant or they're more hesitant to get out of those abusive relationships. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So those are kind of two kind of both positive and negative implications of the prefrontal cortex kind of dimming down. But again, the goal of this thing, the goal of this structure is to help you with your decision-making. Any questions with these two structures here?
Oh yeah, I had a question. As far as the somatosensory, is that the area responsible for muscle memory?
No, and so we'll get to that area.
Okay.
Yeah. So very good question. So this question was, is the somatosensory association area the area responsible for muscle memory? Okay, it's not, and we'll actually get to that area in a little bit. Yeah. Good question. Any other questions here? No? Okay, cool. All right, so that is the first two. The next one is the visual association area. And so the visual association area is an area that's responsible for helping you to be able to recognize whatever it is you're seeing, okay, or whoever it is you're seeing. Okay? And so that's going to be found inside the occipital lobe. Okay? So if you're able to recognize whoever you're seeing, okay, your visual association area is going to be working effectively. However, let's say, for example, me and Josue are best friends. Like we've known each other since we were kids. We grew up together. We're now in our 20s together. We've known each other for forever. Okay? Let's say I go through some kind of trauma and I damage my visual association area. Okay? So I may see Josue and we see each other. I'm not going to recognize him even though I've known him for 20 years. I've seen him for 20 years. I'm not going to know him because my visual association area is damaged and I can no longer recognize who he is. So he may tell me who he is right then and there, and I'll say, okay, oh, you're Josue, I remember you, it's all good. Okay. If I turn around and then turn back, so let's say I kind of do a complete 360, boom, 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 and then I come back and look at Josue again, I'm no longer going to recognize who he is. Okay. Even in just that short time span where I turned around, I'm no longer going to be able to recognize him because, again, my visual association area has been damaged. Okay. And so this is one thing that happens when people typically get into accidents where their visual association area becomes damaged. They're no longer able to recognize who or what they're actually seeing. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, and the next one is the auditory association area, and that one's going to be found inside the temporal lobe. And so the auditory association area helps you to recognize sound. Okay? So for example, if you hear your mom yelling your name, okay, you can say, okay, who's yelling my name? That sounds like my mom. Okay? Is she yelling at me because she's looking for me to come for dinner, or is she yelling at me because she's pissed off? Okay? One of the two, and you're able to recognize, oh no, it's dinner time. Okay, she's yelling at me because she wants dinner. And you're able to recognize the tone in her voice, okay? And then be able to process that information and then do what needs to be done from there. So the auditory association area helps you to recognize sound and then be able to interpret and perceive different aspects of that particular sound. All right. The next one is Wernicke's area. And so Wernicke's area is a region inside the left temporal and parietal lobes. And so this is going to be involved with helping to interpret what speech means, or interpret the meaning of speech by either recognizing spoken words or recognizing written words. And so we'll look at what happens if Wernicke's area gets damaged in a little bit. But this is going to be an area that helps you to be able to produce coherent speech and be able to produce speech that makes sense and be able to understand what people are saying to you. So able to recognize the meaning of different types of speech and written words.
If the
That's Wernicke's.
if
Mhm.
the Wernicke's and the Broca, they could be affected if you have a stroke?
Yes, and we'll look at that too.
Okay.
Yes. Cool. All right, so that's Wernicke's area. All right, so the next area is the common integrative area. And so the common integrative area is going to be found here inside the parietal lobe. And so this area is really, really interesting because it's able to take sensory information from multiple different areas of the brain, okay, pull them all into the common integrative area, and then help you form thoughts based off of all these sensory input that you're receiving. Okay, so it might take visual stimuli, it might take auditory stimuli, it might take tactile stimuli, it might take gustatory, olfactory stimuli, and then bring them all into the common integrative area to help you form thoughts about whatever it is that you're sensing at that point in time. Okay. And then in addition to that, so it's going to help you form thoughts. In addition to being able to form those thoughts, it's also going to be able to send signals from one area of the brain to another in order to help you kind of form the appropriate response based off of the thoughts that you just produced, okay, in that particular area. Okay. All right, so that's the common integrative area. So again, it's able to help you form thoughts based on all your sensory stimuli, and then be able to help you form an appropriate response based off of the sensory stimuli and the thoughts that you've made as a result of those. All right, then the last one is the premotor area. And so the premotor area is here in the frontal lobe. And so this is the area that is involved with muscle memory. So this goes back to Josue's question. Okay. So the premotor area is involved with helping you to plan what types of motor activities you want to perform. Okay. And it's going to be involved with helping to produce and initiate a lot of those more complex motor movements. Okay. And specifically, it's going to be involved with muscle memory. Okay. So that's going to be here inside the premotor area. I believe that's everything there. All right, any questions on any of these association areas? I know there's kind of a lot of them. Okay, so for the sake of the exam, I do want you to be comfortable with all of the sensory areas, the motor areas, and the association areas. Be comfortable or have a general idea of what they do and what lobe they're found in. All right, any questions before we go forward here?
You know the visual association area? Is that, have you seen the movie 21st Dates where they had to tell her, reintroduce himself over and over? Is that what happened?
I haven't seen that movie, but I would guess that yes, that would be it.
Okay.
So yeah, because the visual association area gets damaged, you would basically have to keep reintroducing yourself to the same person over and over and over and over and over and over and over again.
Okay, thank you. I just want to get it to stick.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. Actually, that reminds me. So there's another example of the prefrontal cortex that I forgot to mention earlier, which is another kind of interesting one. And so with the prefrontal cortex, there was a guy, I can't remember his name, I think it was in the early 1900s. And so he was always kind of, I wish I could remember his name, but he was generally a really gentle guy, really nice guy, always very thoughtful, like real chill dude. Okay. Now at this point in time, he was working at a railroad or helping to build railroads, and some TNT went off, okay, and caused one of the railroad spikes to spike up through his eye, and it actually damaged the prefrontal cortex. And so after that particular incident, he survived it, okay, but after kind of recovering from that particular injury by damaging the prefrontal cortex, his whole personality shifted. And so instead of being a pretty gentle, very thoughtful guy, he became very impulsive, very angry, very aggressive kind of guy. And again, all that is due to the damaging of the prefrontal cortex, which is involved with your personality, decision-making, judgment, and impulse, and things like that. So that was just another example, again, just to kind of help with all these different areas here.
Yeah.
George, which areas did you say you wanted us to be comfortable with for the exam?
So be comfortable with all of them.
Okay. Okay.
So be comfortable with all of these sensory areas. Mainly this, as far as the sensory areas, be comfortable with, especially with the primary visual area, the auditory area, and then the somatosensory area.
Okay.
Don't worry so much about the olfactory and the gustatory area.
Okay.
But everything else I do want you to be comfortable with.
Okay. Sounds
George,
good.
I have a quick question about the primary visual area and visual association area. Is there a difference between the two at all, or is it?
Yeah. So there's a slight difference between the two. So the primary visual area is just the place where all of that sensory information is just going to be coming to. Okay? But the visual association area is going to be responsible for actually doing something or helping you to actually process that information. Okay? So helping you to actually kind of do something or do something with the visual information that's coming there.
Right, and that was an example of post sway, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's going to be the example of like being able to recognize something. Okay. Right. The visual area just helps you kind of be that's going to be where the information is going to be coming to first, okay? Specifically where they're coming to first. And then in order to get processed, they're going to move specifically into that association area in order for that processing to take place.
Okay.
Does that kind of help clarify that a little bit better?
Yeah. So that's like the place where it happens and receives the information, and then visual association is like the process of actually happening, right?
Exactly. Okay. Any other questions here?
No.
Okay. All right, so this is just a larger picture, again, to kind of help you with that. So we've looked at a couple areas in the brain that are involved with language. Okay, we looked at Broca's area, which helps you to be able to produce language and be able to, basically produce language and plan language, or plan what you want to say. Wernicke's area helps you to be able to interpret what language means, or the meaning of language. Okay? And so if either of these two areas gets damaged by a stroke, like Priscilla had mentioned earlier, if either of these two areas gets damaged either by stroke or because of a seizure or whatever it may be, you can have an inability to produce or comprehend language. Okay? And so that's what we call aphasia. Okay, so we have two different types of aphasia. We have Broca's aphasia, or also called non-fluence aphasia, where you have damage to Broca's area. Okay? And so people who have Broca's aphasia don't have the ability to produce words as effectively as they could. Okay? They know what they want to say, but they have a hard time getting the words out because they have a hard time with the muscle contraction and planning what it is they want to say. Okay? The muscle contraction of the muscles involved with speech. Okay? So there's the video here. Because the audio doesn't work all that well with Zoom, I'm gonna have you watch these videos after class. So just kind of make sure you take care of that. So that's Broca's area. You know what you want to say, but you have a hard time getting the words out because the muscles involved with speech don't work as effectively because of the damage to the brain. Wernicke's aphasia is also called fluent aphasia, where you produce words effectively, but the words that you're coming out, the words that are coming out have no meaning. Okay? There's no cohesion with the words that you're producing. So for example, someone who has Wernicke's aphasia might be trying to say, hey, hey, how are you doing? But they might say, sky, cloud, boat, toaster, in the fridge, or something like that. Okay? So they're producing words effectively, easily, okay? But the words that are coming out don't make any sense together. Okay? And so that's what we call word salad, where you're just producing a bunch of words that don't make any sense together. Okay? And so in these two videos, there's a video that has a patient who has had a stroke, and that damaged Broca's aphasia. And so you're going to be able to see that he knows what he wants to say and he's thinking about what he wants to say, but he has a hard time getting the words out. Okay. The second video shows Wernicke's aphasia. So you have a patient who's easily able to get words out, but what he's saying has absolutely no meaning and it makes no sense. Okay. So watch those two videos. These are two questions that are a question that may show up on the exam as well. So be comfortable with these two types of aphasia. Okay. Any questions on Broca's aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia? Okay. All right. So if not, we had a question here. So which functional area of the cerebrum is indicated in the figure here? Okay. So here, are we looking at the visual association area, the primary auditory area, the primary motor area, the somatosensory association area, or the primary somatosensory area? What do we think?
Not the visual, because that's at the end.
It's somatosensory, but I'm not sure if it's a primary or.
It's primary somatosensory.
Primary somato.
Yep, it's
E?
E.
Yeah,
Yeah,
primary.
G.
Yeah, that's probably right.
Yes, absolutely. So this is going to be E. So this is the primary somatosensory area. So the primary somatosensory area is going to be right behind the central sulcus, whereas the somatosensory association area is going to be a little bit further behind, further posterior.
Mhm.
All right, good. That's the primary somatosensory area. And again, actually, let me ask you guys. So what's the job of the primary somatosensory area? What does it do?
Is it processing information?
So it kind of recognizes like if someone touched you on your skin, like you'd recognize from like pain or an itching sensation, like hot or cold, or kind of like location where it, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So the primary somatosensory area is involved with anything that has to do with your tactile sensation. Okay? So anything having to do with pain, anything having to do with pressure, touch, itch, anything like that. That is all going to be directed to the primary somatosensory area. Good. All right, cool. Okay. So last few slides here. So the first thing that we're going to look at here as far as the cerebral cortex is called hemispheric lateralization. And so this is just a fancy way of saying that each hemisphere of the brain is good at doing certain things. Okay? So there's going to be some subtle differences that are going to be existing in between the left hemisphere and the right cerebral hemisphere, which allows each hemisphere to be good at doing certain things. So for example, the left cerebral hemisphere is going to be more, as far as analysis, going to be better for analysis and details, logic, things like that. So for example, it's going to be really good with analytical thought. It's going to be best suited for details, sequences, rational thought, verbal communication, consciousness, planning, math and science, logic. And then it's also going to be responsible for processing information on your right visual field. Okay, so again, your left hemisphere is going to be taking information from your right visual field, as well as controlling your right motor movements. Okay. The right cerebral hemisphere is going to be doing the opposite. So it's going to be more based off, or more suited for kind of more emotional, more creative, more creative and more emotional, imaginative kind of thought patterns. Okay. So it's going to be more better for intuition, better for kind of holistic perception, more random sequences, emotion. More people who are right brain tend to be more adventurous, more creative, and then again, creative in terms of kind of writing and art and things like that. And then again, they're also going to be processing the left visual field and left hemisphere, or left visual field and left motor skills better on the right side. Okay. So each side of the brain is going to be best suited for doing certain things that the other side of the brain is not going to be best suited for. Okay. And so that's kind of where, people being left brain and right brain kind of comes into play here. So people who are left brained are more kind of analytical. Okay. People who are right brain tend to be more creative in terms of their writing and things like that. So that's hemispheric lateralization. The next thing here is memory. And so memory is going to be a process that's going to be the way we're able to take in lots of information and then store it for long periods of time. Okay? Information that we've learned over time is going to get stored inside of our brain here. Okay? And so this is going to require different types of changes within the brain, both structural changes and functional changes. And pretty much every part of the brain is going to be involved with the memory process in some form or fashion. Okay? So all the lobes, the limbic system, and the hippocampus, those are all going to be involved with memory to some degree, and especially the hippocampus, because again, it's going to be producing new neurons whenever you learn something new. Okay? And so motor memory specifically is going to be based off of the basal nuclei, based off the cerebellum, and the cerebral cortex all working together to help you produce muscle memory. All right. So that is that. Last slide here is we're going to be looking at brain waves. And so in order for us to be able to study the brain effectively, especially in a clinical setting, one of the things that we want to be able to do is we want to be able to measure the action potentials happening throughout the brain, throughout the neurons inside the brain. And so in order to do that, we're going to be using a process that's similar to the ECGs and EKGs that we looked at when we were looking at the heart. Okay? But we're specifically going to be using what's called an electroencephalogram. Okay? And that is going to be able to detect brain waves. Okay? Brain waves are just a collection of action potentials happening inside the brain. Okay? And so this is a picture of my mother-in-law. And so she has epilepsy. And so this was a picture taken a few years ago where she was getting an electroencephalogram or an EEG done at Stanford to try to figure out where exactly her seizures were coming from. And so EEGs are typically best used for being able to study brain disorders, like epilepsy or other types of brain disorders. It's responsible for, or it's able to be used for detecting changes in sleep and looking at how sleep patterns are changing over time, studying brain functions. And basically the way it works is you take these series of electrodes and you attach them all over the head, and each of the electrodes is going to be responsible for picking up on action potentials in different parts of the brain. Okay? And so then you end up getting an EEG reading. And so these readings here will be able to tell you what part of the brain is acting normally and which part of the brains are not acting normally. Okay? And then again, you can kind of use that to help diagnose where the problem is and what the problem is. Okay? So those are brain waves. Again, those are going to be detected using an EEG or electroencephalogram. All right, and that is that. That's everything for this chapter. Any questions on anything we've covered from chapter 18 here?
No.
So I know this was kind of a lot going over these last couple of days, but I hope kind of breaking it into 2 days kind of helps it kind of sink in a little bit better.
Yeah.
How do we feel on a scale of 1 to 10?
Like a 6 or a 7.
Seven?
No, I would say a 7. I'd say 7.
I'll say a 7 for me.
I'm really glad it was broken.
All right, cool.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you did a great
definitely.
job.
Yeah, if it wasn't breaking down.
Yeah, the brain has a lot.
Way too much.
Yeah.
But it's a 7 now. It's a 7.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, so the brain, there's a lot going on in the brain as we're able to see. You have a lot of different functions happening in different parts of the brain. Okay, so try to get as comfortable as you can with it over the next couple of weeks before the exam. Yeah, so ideally kind of breaking it apart, kind of take it piece by piece, and as you kind of take it one piece at a time, it'll start to make a little bit more sense. So you should be pretty good with this. Okay? And this is a really important part of the body, not just for anatomy, but just in general, in terms of controlling, what's happening inside the brain, what's happening with your emotions, what's happening throughout the body as well. Okay, any questions I can answer before we take off for today?
Yeah, I have one question for the lab, George.
Mm-hmm.
So for pages 281 and 283, I know you said, because I had asked about the observations, and there's like 2, I'm pretty sure, like 9 and 10, that you actually need equipment for. And so do you want to put the observations right there, like unable to perform?
No, you don't need to worry about observations for that. So anything that you're not able to do, just leave the observations blank, but just write in what cranial nerve is going to be activated for that.
Yeah, I already did that. It was just the observations. I was like, oh, do I write anything or should I not? Okay.
No, you don't need to worry about writing anything.
All right, cool. Thank you.
No problem.
All right. Cool.
Any other questions?
No.
Thanks for a cool lecture.
So for the